The restaurant wasn't quiet. It was worse than that. It was waiting. Hong Kong, 1950. The rain outside had stopped an hour ago, but the streets were still wet. Puddles reflected the neon signs from across the street, reds and yellows bleeding into the dark water like watercolor paint on silk. Inside the Golden Phoenix restaurant, white tablecloths covered every surface. Crystal glasses caught the light from chandeliers overhead, throwing fractured rainbows across the walls. Silver cutlery gleamed against porcelain plates. The air smelled of roasted duck and expensive wine, of cigars and perfume imported from Paris. Most of the guests were British, military officers, colonial administrators, merchants who'd made fortunes in trade. A few were wealthy locals who'd learned to dress like them, who spoke English at their tables and avoided eye contact with the Chinese staff who served them. The divide was invisible but absolute, like a wall built from silence and unspoken rules. Ip Man walked through the door alone. He wore a simple Cheng Shan, dark blue, clean but not expensive. The fabric was cotton, not silk. There were no embroidered dragons on the chest, no jade buttons at the collar. His shoes were old but polished, the leather worn at the edges. Watermarks traced the soles where he'd walked through puddles on his way from the tram stop. He moved like water, no rush, no hesitation, each step placed with quiet intention. He walked past the host stand where a young woman in a red kapow stood frozen, her mouth half open as if to speak but unable to find words. He walked past tables where conversations paused mid-sentence, where British officers looked up from their steaks with furrowed brows, where wealthy Chinese diners looked away quickly as if afraid to be associated with this disruption. He walked past waiters who froze with trays balanced on their palms, their eyes wide with something between fear and fascination. He walked to an empty table near the window, the one with the best view of the harbor, and stood beside it. His hand rested lightly on the chair back. He didn't pull it out, not yet. He simply stood there, waiting. A waiter approached. Young, Chinese, maybe 20 years old. His white jacket was spotless, but his hands trembled slightly as he carried a folded menu. He glanced toward the back of the room where the manager stood, a heavy-set Englishman with a thick mustache that drooped past his chin, arms crossed over his chest, eyes narrowed to slits. The manager's face was already red, not from embarrassment, from anger barely contained. The waiter stopped a few feet away from Ip Man. He didn't make eye contact. His gaze remained fixed on the floor between them. "Sir?" he said quietly in Cantonese, his voice barely above a whisper, nearly drowned out by the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversation around them. "This section is reserved." Ip Man looked at him, not unkindly. His expression remained neutral, patient, like a teacher waiting for a student to finish a difficult question. "Reserved for whom?" The waiter didn't answer. He looked down at his shoes, black leather scuffed at the toes from countless hours standing, serving, bowing. His jaw tightened. A muscle twitched near his temple. The manager walked over, slow and deliberate. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Each step seemed louder than the last, a drumbeat announcing confrontation. He stopped directly in front of Ip Man, close enough that most men would have stepped back, close enough that Ip Man could smell the whiskey on his breath, the pomade in his hair. Ip Man didn't move. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't lean away. He simply stood there, his breathing steady, his eyes forward, looking not at the manager's face, but through it, as if seeing something beyond. "I'd like a table," Ip Man said in perfect English. His voice was calm, clear, measured. No accent softened the words, no hesitation weakened them. The manager's jaw tightened. His face flushed slightly, the red creeping up from his collar to his cheeks. A few guests at nearby tables stopped eating. Forks hovered over plates, knives rested against china edges. A woman in a green dress whispered something to her husband, who shook his head slowly. The room grew quieter. Not silent. There was still the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen, the low murmur of a conversation at the far end of the room, the soft scrape of a chair being adjusted, but quieter, expectant, like the moment before thunder follows lightning. "Did you hear me?" the manager said, leaning forward slightly. His breath came faster now. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Ip Man's face flushed deep red, his fists clenched tighter. "I said—" Ip Man raised one hand, palm open, fingers relaxed. Not a threat, not a plea, not a gesture of surrender, just a simple motion that said, "Wait, listen." "I am not here to fight," Ip Man said quietly. His voice carried across the room even though he barely raised it. Every word was measured, controlled, delivered with the precision of a craftsman placing the final piece in a puzzle. "I am not here to cause trouble. I am not here to make a statement or prove a point. I am here to eat, to sit at a table and have a meal like any other person in this city. If you refuse me, I will sit here. If you call the police, I will sit here. If you try to remove me by force, I will sit here." He folded his hands on the table in front of him. His back was straight. His shoulders were relaxed. His breathing remained even and deep. "I will not raise my voice. I will not raise my hand. I will not break anything or threaten anyone, but I will not leave. Not until I am ready. Not because you tell me to. I will sit here as long as it takes for you to understand one simple truth." He paused. The room held its breath. Some things cannot be pushed. They can only be respected. The manager stared at him. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His fists remained clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He looked around the room, at the British guests watching, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, some with barely concealed amusement at seeing their host challenged, at the Chinese staff frozen near the kitchen doorway with wide eyes and open mouths, at the silence that had swallowed every conversation, every clink of glass, every breath. 10 seconds passed. Maybe less, maybe more. Time had become strange, elastic, stretched thin by tension. The manager's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Ip Man again, really looked this time, not at an obstacle to be removed, not at a problem to be solved, but at a man, at the calm in his eyes that held no anger, no fear, no pride, at the stillness in his posture that suggested not stubbornness, but certainty, at the complete absence of aggression or defiance, at the absolute conviction that this man would not be moved, not by threats, not by force, not by shame or intimidation or anything else the world could throw at him. The manager's face shifted. The anger didn't disappear entirely, but something else appeared beneath it. Uncertainty, confusion, maybe even a flicker of respect, though he'd never admit it, not to anyone, not even to himself. He turned and walked toward the kitchen without another word. His footsteps were quieter now, less certain, less deliberate. The door swung shut behind him with a soft thud. For a moment, nothing happened. The room remained frozen, suspended in that strange space between confrontation and resolution. Then, slowly, a fork clinked against a plate. A conversation resumed in whispers. A waiter moved toward another table with a tray of drinks. A moment later, the young waiter returned. His hands were shaking slightly as he placed a menu on the table in front of Ip Man. He glanced back toward the kitchen, then at Ip Man, then at the floor. What would you like to order, sir?" he asked in Cantonese, his voice barely steady. Ip Man looked up at him and smiled. Small, kind, the kind of smile that says, "You did nothing wrong. You have nothing to fear." "Tea," he said softly. "Just tea. Nothing more." The waiter nodded quickly and hurried away. His shoulders seemed lighter, his steps less burdened. Around the room, life continued. Forks began to move again. Conversations resumed, quieter than before, but present. But every few moments, someone would glance toward the window, toward the man in the simple blue changshen, sitting alone, hands folded, waiting for his tea with the patience of stone. When it arrived, It Man poured it slowly. He held the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth spread through his palms. He didn't drink quickly. He savored each sip, letting the liquid roll across his tongue, breathing in the steam that rose in delicate spirals. His eyes looked out the window at the wet streets below, at the people passing by under umbrellas even though the rain had stopped, at the reflection of the chandeliers in the glass, at the city that was changing as it tried desperately to stay the same. He stayed for an hour. He didn't order food. He didn't speak to anyone. He simply sat and drank his tea and watched the world outside. When he finished, when the pot was empty and the cup had been refilled 3 times, he placed a coin on the table, enough to cover the tea and a generous tip for the young waiter who'd shown more courage than he probably knew, stood and walked toward the door. As he passed the kitchen, the young waiter stepped forward, blocking his path. His eyes were red, his voice cracked when he spoke. "Master Ip, how did you make him stop? What did you do?" Ip Man paused. He looked at the boy for a long moment. His expression was gentle, almost sad, as if he understood something the boy couldn't see yet. "I didn't make him do anything," he said quietly. "I didn't force him or trick him or shame him. I simply showed him that some things cannot be pushed. They can only be respected. Dignity is not something that can be given or taken away. It simply is. And when you understand that, truly understand it, nothing can make you move unless you choose to move." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder just for a moment, then walked out into the wet streets of Hong Kong. Behind him, the Golden Phoenix restaurant continued its evening, but something had shifted, something small, something quiet, something that couldn't be undone or forgotten or explained away. The next week, 3 Chinese families ate there without incident. The week after that, 5 more. Within a month, the Golden Phoenix was serving anyone who could afford the prices. The manager never apologized. He never explained. He never even acknowledged that anything had changed, but he never refused service again. And sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was empty and he was counting receipts alone in his office, he'd remember the man in the blue changshen, the man who had sat at his table without permission, the man who refused to move, and he'd wonder, just for a moment, what it must feel like to have that kind of certainty, that kind of peace. No one ever mentioned what happened that night, but everyone knew. Ip Man never returned to the Golden Phoenix. He didn't need to. The point was made. Not with fists, not with shouting, not with violence or threats or dramatic gestures. With stillness, with dignity, with 10 seconds of silence that changed everything.